Does the government have the right to deny citizens rights in order to protect the security of the nation?
Japanese internment. FDR signed Executive Order 9066, which was what imprisoned all the Japanese Americans. Many of the imprisoned Japanese were prominent leaders in society. Among the inter-Japanese, there was not even one case of espionage or sabotage in the United States. The Nisei, which were the second-generation Japanese Americans, were drafted and encouraged to join the War for America. Japanese American Evacuation Claims Act helped the Japanese Americans recover, with token payments after the war.
Pros of Japanese internment. Japanese internment gave American citizens a false sense of security because the Japanese population as a whole were segregated from the rest of America. As previously noted, second-generation Japanese Americans were given the opportunity to show their loyalty to the United States by enlisting in the Army.
Japanese internment cons. After the Japanese internment ended in 1945, a federal commission's finding convinced Congress that the Japanese internment was wrong and acknowledged that a grave injustice was done. Even today, Congress fined to compensate those who were affected. In 1988, Congress attempted to apologize by awarding each surviving intern $20,000. Japanese freedom was taken away because they were forced to leave all their belongings and go into the designated camps. Japanese people were given 1 week to register to authorities, take care of their belongings, and liquidate their past lives before being admitted into the internment. Racism grew within the United States after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and after Japanese Americans were admitted into the concentration camps. However, Japanese Americans were mainly born in the United States, which should consider them as U.S. citizens because they are only from Japanese descent. This shows the government's notice that all the Japanese had to enter the camps. These pictures show the racism that grew throughout the country. The racism was shown through propaganda pictures. The purpose was to motivate the Americans to fight against the Japanese. This picture shows the Japanese camps where they were designated into certain buildings by families.
Supreme Court case, reactions of ACLU and NAACP. The Korematsu versus United States case was one of the many cases presented by the American Civil Liberties Union and the National Association for Advancement of Colored People that argued against the ultimate power of the government during this time. Fred Korematsu was arrested for defying the government. The ACLU thought this to be unfair judgment. They offered to defend Korematsu in a lawsuit against the United States challenging the Executive Order 9066. The ACLU and the NAACP were strictly against the internment. The ACLU had a plan to use Korematsu's case in order to challenge the internment and prove that it was unnecessary and wrong on the government's part.
Restriction on foreigners. On February 1942, President FDR signed the Executive Order 9066, in which he would give permission for military commanders to relocate any type of people who were seen as threat to the well-being of the country. Since this was shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the United States started rounding up and taking away the Japanese population to internment camps. Even Japanese Americans that had citizenship were taken away from their homes and their work to be relocated to internment camps for the duration of the war. During that time, 30,000 Japanese Americans, known as Nisei, served the American Army as they began to recruit more people. The Japanese, however, were the ones that suffered the most with this executive order, as more than 110,000 Japanese people were taken to the internment camps. Groups of people from the other countries that were part of the Axis powers didn't nearly suffer as much as Japanese, as there were very few accounts of Italian or German Americans being relocated to camps. Americans claimed that the Japanese community was much more strongly bonded to its culture and idealism and were seen as bigger threat of espionage.
Point of view of the Japanese prisoners and the conditions they lived under. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government created strict rules such as curfew hours, and the government raided their homes for anything with relation to their homeland, since it was considered to be contraband. After 2 months, President Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066 authorization to the War Relocation Authority to force 110,000 Japanese and their American-born children into relocation camps. These people were placed into barracks located in Arizona, Utah, California, Wyoming, Arkansas, Idaho, and Colorado, as the United States claimed that it was for the Japanese American safety. Though the conditions were tough, the Japanese were moved to their designated barracks in their corresponding families.
Farewell to Manzanar. The 1973 book, Farewell to Manzanar, by Gene Wakatsuki and James D. Houston, talks about the experiences of the Wakatsuki family during their time living in an internment camp in the desert, 225 miles northeast of Los Angeles. The book shows the poor living conditions under which the families were placed, since they were cramped together, ate badly prepared food, and slept in unfinished barracks. They also redact how many of the Japanese in the camps would fall ill from the poorly conserved food and had to face the indignity of the non-partitioned camp toilets.
Korematsu case. The Korematsu case consisted of the refusal of the 22-year-old second-generation Japanese-American Fred Korematsu. He refused into joining his family to report to Tanforan based on his belief that he was a loyal American and not a national security threat. On May 30th, 1942, Fred Korematsu was arrested and put in jail for staying in a military zone. Tried in the United States District Court, he was found guilty of violating the Civilian Exclusion Order number 34 and was sentenced to 5 years of probation. On December 18, 1944, the Supreme Court issued its decision on the Korematsu versus the U.S. case, which upheld Fred Korematsu's conviction by a vote of 6-3. Based on the Supreme Court's findings that Fred Korematsu was not removed from his home because of hostility to him or his race, but because the United States was at war with Japan and the United States military feared an invasion of our West Coast.
Internments versus concentration camps. Concentration camps. The Nazi regime built a series of detention facilities to imprison and eliminate the so-called enemies of the state. Forced labor was placed on the camps where thousands of prisoners died from exhaustion, starvation, and exposure, as well as SS units guarded the camps. Nazi doctors performed medical experiments on the prisoners. The killing centers were designated for efficient mass murder. These killing centers were created in order to systematically murder the Jews of the general government. As in the concentration camps, Japanese internment. As in the concentration camps in Germany, internment camps were overcrowded and did not provide good living conditions for the people living there. There, they slept in poorly constructed barracks, and since there was no coal, they would sleep under as many blankets as they could find. Food was rationed, and it was of bad quality. In addition, families were often separated as they were sent to different concentration camps.
Well, roughly 90 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt issued an executive order authorizing the establishment of the War Relocation Authority to the United States Army. Soon thereafter, another executive order, number 9066, was issued that would lead to the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans. It is clear that this was not a purely political decision, but was reached with the influence of other cultural factors. Once the order was published, the citizens were to report to the relocation centers with only the belongings they could carry. Their personal property, businesses, and real estate holdings, numbering into the hundreds of thousands of acres, were essentially confiscated and sold or given away. One notable difference between Nazi and American captors, besides the obvious practice of genocide, was that the Japanese Americans were transported and placed in camps as family units. While this was not a perfect condition, it was one in which there might be a semblance of humanity imposed. This may also be a factor in how, upon their release, they were able to resume life, displaced and destitute that they were. It must also be mentioned that in spite of the ill treatment, over 17,000 Japanese Americans volunteered to fight for the United States in World War II.